Well, another low in the relationship between India and Canada is the big focus this evening, with the Prime Minister hitting out in Canada over the attack on a Hindu temple in Brampton in Ontario. The Prime Minister has said that this is entirely unacceptable, what has taken place. India will not be intimidated, and Canada must ensure the safety of Indian nationals. Joining us now, a very special guest, Ujjwal Dosanjh, the former Minister of Health of Canada. Mr. Dosanjh, do you believe that enough is being done to ensure that Indo-Canadians and Indian nationals in Canada are being adequately protected?
You know, the Khalistani violence has existed here for a long time. It had kind of died down for a while, and then Mr. Trudeau's arrival, with his arrival, it raised its ugly head more seriously again. What happened at the Brampton temple, obviously unfortunate, unacceptable, condemnable. But it also happened at one of the Surrey Hindu temple. It also happened at the Sikh temple in Vancouver. So it's not isolated. Khalistanis obviously have been doing violence to other Sikhs in temples for a long, long time. And Canadian government hasn't paid much attention. The law enforcement hasn't paid much attention. And now it's spilled over into the Hindu temples, partly because of the consular officials being there. But partly maybe it's a plan by the Khalistanis to try and drive a wedge between the Sikhs and Hindus that have lived here peacefully as they have in India. Obviously, with the exception of 1984, when that was a horrible situation, unacceptable. But, with the exception of that, the Sikhs and Hindus forever have lived peacefully together. So this may be partly their effort to sow some division and hopefully carry that division from Canada over into India. That's their hope, because they want to finally dismember the country. But the government of Canada, the political class in Canada, they have been, in a certain slumber about these issues, whether inadvertently or advertently. They have not condemned Khalistani violence. They have not named Khalistani violence. They have not called it out. Even the denunciations that have now come from the three leaders don't mention the Khalistanis by name at all. It seems that these guys came from somewhere up in the skies and dropped in and created violence. They're not Khalistanis. They're not Canadians, at least it seems from their statements. And so, the political class has been in somewhat of an amnesia on this issue for a long time. And the law enforcement has left a lot to be desired.
Where does that leave Justin Trudeau? I know he's condemned the attack, as it were, but he's not mentioned or spoken about the Khalistani angle. A lot of people observing what's taken place, and you've got Khalistani flags over there in the video that we're showing. It just seems that he continues to be in denial.
Well, I don't think he's in denial. I think he knows exactly what's happening. Khalistanis were in his cabinet. Khalistanis and Islamists, who I know, who wanted an end to the anti-terror legislation in Canada as part of their program to support a particular candidate for whom I was seeking their support in leadership campaign. And they ended up in his cabinet. So he knows fully what he's doing. He's not oblivious to it. I think he's doing it because he says, why make enemies? Even if you have 1,000 votes in a riding that are Khalistani, why make them angry? I think the Conservatives are following the same kind of playbook. They've canceled the Diwali event that I have attended when I was an MP for 7 years in Ottawa. And unfortunately, there are no political figures in this country right now in the political mainstream that stand up and say Khalistani violence, Khalistani hate, it doesn't belong in this country. Do you seriously believe that, as Pannu has done, called for the expulsion of Hindus from Canada, do you seriously believe that somebody had stood up and asked for the expulsion of Jews from Canada, that he wouldn't be prosecuted? He wouldn't be picked up by the police the next day and investigated? So there is a total amnesia on this issue, a total lack of effort on the part of the law enforcement as well as the politicians.
Mr. Dosanjh, a lot of the individuals in that temple were Indian nationals. As I understand it, they were being given consular services by the Indian High Commission or the consulate. It's something which has happened forever. A lot of them, for example, if they're Indian nationals, would need to draw their pensions. They need to, they've come into Canada late in their lives, and so they need that consular assistance. Do you believe that this was a deliberate effort at thwarting that or attempting to stop that?
Oh, absolutely. It is an effort to harm Indians here generally and to try and create a wedge and to try and prevent the consular officials from helping Indian citizens or Canadian citizens who need these life certificates. You know, in Toronto, I know the consulate is way over downtown, miles away from where people live. So it's good for the consular officials to come to various temples and places and hold these things. And I understand that I saw a photograph of people inside. There were lots of Sikhs and Hindus, people who had come, old people who had come to get their life certificates. So this wasn't even about, consulars aren't there to just help the Hindus. I mean, they're helping all Indians.
Yeah.
And,
is there a sense
it's
of fear, Mr.
unfortunate.
Dosanjh, among members of the Indo-Canadian community? This is one of the most credentialed community in Canada, extremely educated, extremely successful, extremely prosperous. And people who, by and large, 99.99% have nothing to do with any of this. Is there a sense of fear in that community?
Oh, absolutely. There's been fear in the Sikh community, for a long time. This violence has been going on in the Sikh temples for a long time. That's why moderates have simply walked away, because they can't be physically fighting. The police haven't helped very much. The politicians haven't helped very much. Now it's spilled over onto the Hindu temples. And, unfortunately, it shouldn't be a thing of joy, but I think perhaps because now the conflict seems to have widened, and perhaps more attention might be paid by the politicians and the law enforcement.
Mr. Dosanjh, the other very disturbing aspect which emerged just a couple of days back was that Canada is actively keeping track of Indian consular officials. A few diplomats who are remaining, they are spying on them. They are using video surveillance and audio surveillance as well. That, many in India seem to suggest, is a breach of basic consular and diplomatic protocol. At a time when the relations between the two sides have really plummeted, isn't that still a bit too much?
Well, look, covert operations go on. All countries do that, where it is a violation of the diplomatic, traditions and laws, international rules and norms. But most countries do it. I'm not suggesting Canada should do it, but we understand, as people who know the world a little bit, that it happens. I'm not justifying it, but it happens. And I'm sure India does the same. The US does it all the time. How do you think, how else did they find out what Indian diplomats or others might have been doing about Niger or somebody else, or Patwant Singh, Gurpatwant Pannu? They do that because they eavesdrop, right? It's not right. It's not proper. Most countries would give you a lesson saying, oh, we should obey diplomatic norms, comply with them. They know all of them breach them, if they can.
One final question, Mr. Dosanjh. The entire, you've spent decades in Canada. The entire problem with the Khalistani movement is not new. It's existed for decades on end. I've been a student in Canada. My father being a diplomat, we were protected by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police way back in 1991 because of this threat. It's existed for decades. It's never found space, in the Canadian media, other than occasional stories here and there. It's always been a factor in Canada's life. Is it now something which is out of control?
Oh, it is. Obviously, if you can have violent elements who can go to 3 temples around the same time in 3 different cities across the country and cause violence, it is out of hand. It is, in fact, it's a blemish, a very strong blemish on our law enforcement, on the reputation of our law enforcement, and politicians. Politicians have failed to condemn this violence and hate. It's existed in Canada, it continues to grow, and law enforcement has done very little to enforce the laws that could have been enforced.
Ujjwal Dosanjh, thank you very much, sir, for speaking to us and sort of expressing your concerns at what you're seeing unfold in your country. Thank you very much indeed. Joining us now, Punit Sani, an expert on the evolution of the Sikh identity and terrorism affiliated with Khalistan. Terry Milewski is an author, and Dr. Tara Karta and Brahma Chelani. Punit, let me come to you first. Do you believe that this was an effort at driving a wedge between members of one faith and members of another on Canadian soil?
Two things. So, of course, it is. I'll just give you the facts. So, if you see the pictures from that temple that was attacked, there were so many Sikhs in the attendance, right? So, Sikhs went to that temple as well.
Yeah.
But like last night, where there was like a meeting in the temple and everybody was talking and they were outraged, no Sikh came. And it was not that they did not want to come. Like, I have so many messages. They are outraged. But they're like, what do we do? Like, there is a mafia, and we have children, and we have businesses. And we cannot fight with these criminals. But, and they can feel the outrage that is building. So, of course, and, we have gone through this and, nobody, and, I just want to make a point. I was listening to what Mr. Dosanjh was saying. So the thing is, democracy is no panacea. Democracy has its own constraints. And Canada is in a situation, it cannot be fixed. I'll give you an example. In 1985, when Mr. Dosanjh was speaking, Vancouver, where all these terrorists came that blew up the plane, it was 85% white. So there were very few immigrants. And Mr. Dosanjh and his wife and his little children, they had to sleep on the ground. They could not sleep on the bed because they feared like the bullets would come from the window. You can ask him, you read his book. And right now, there are only like 43% whites in Vancouver. So, and these Khalistanis are importing. So it is politically impossible for anybody to basically take on these people. So Canada is basically a Pakistan of the West. And, it's a nuisance. And you can try to win their hearts or you can try to cajole them. It cannot be fixed. And we have to deal with it like it is a Pakistan. It is a nuisance and we have to set a deterrent. And I have a lot of problem with what, I am against Khalistanis and I'm on the ground fighting against it. And I don't know how much time you have, but I blame the Modi government, which has removed the deterrent against Khalistanis. And that's why we are dealing with this nonsense.
Terry Milewski, what does any political party in Canada actually do to get rid of these elements? It's now out of control.
Well, I disagree that it's impossible. I agree that it's difficult. And the reason it's difficult is because of a lack of courage and knowledge. Lack of courage on the part of the politicians who they get intimidated. Let's be blunt about it. They are intimidated, not necessarily just by the threat of a physical attack upon them personally, but their supporters. Business might dry up at your business. Bad things can happen, to put it mildly. They're concerned about that, and also they're ignorant about the nature of the threat. They think that Khalistanis, that Sikhs are all Khalistanis. A lot of politicians are completely ignorant of the fact, for example, that the vast majority of Sikhs, where most of them live in Punjab, have absolutely no time for this separatist nonsense. They oppose it and have for years. And this is completely news, apparently, to a lot of Canadian politicians say, well, we mustn't upset the Sikhs because that's the same thing as upsetting the Khalistanis. And they can be a pretty tough bunch when it comes to election time, and I don't want to antagonize them. That's what that has been. That lack of courage on the part of the political class has been blowing up this threat, making it bigger and worse year after year for 40 years in Canada. And I think that the reason I say, with great respect to Punit, who's I think done fantastic work on this whole file, that I disagree with him that it's impossible to fix. It's out of hand. It's out of control. Because you can imagine, I can imagine, we can all imagine what would happen in Canada if we called their bluff. And if the politicians said, okay, from here on, if you're going to have a Vaisakhi Day parade carrying glorious posters glorifying the Air India bomber, the Kanishka bomber, Talvinder Singh Parmar, through the streets of Canada, then we're not going to come to your Vaisakhi parade. Go ahead, vote for somebody else. We're not going to play your game anymore. We're not going to dance to your tune, which is what they've been doing all these years. Well, what would they do then? If the political parties said, no, we're not going to do that anymore, and we're going to manage to get ourselves elected without you, thanks very much, who are you going to vote for if we all join together?
Yeah.
And we say no.
All right, let me
Who are
go
you going to
across
vote
to...
for?
Sure. Let me go across to Dr. Tara Karthab. Just when you thought that relations between India and Canada couldn't, be at a lower ebb, this sort of thing has happened. And, it's frightening because it's not just India, elements in Canada targeting India, they're targeting Canadian nationals, their own nationals, who happen to be of ethnic Indian origin. The ramifications for Canada are dire.
See, from what the previous speakers also said and what I read, what I've been talking to friends so far, there is a systemic problem. The RCMP itself has put out a notice, I think it was yesterday or day before, saying that we don't get intelligence on extremist groups. They don't know what's going on. And well, between us, the history of RCMP in dealing with such things, not just this, in others also is not that great. There is a systemic problem in identifying what the problem is. It's high time they looked at the policing that they're doing in Canada. Number two, the fact is that suddenly this word Hindu-phobia is around. I don't know where that's come from. You had all this talk of Islam-phobia, now you talk of Hindu-phobia, and you've got attacks on, I think I've counted about 26 odd attacks against temples overall, where mayors of those cities have condemned it. I mean, in fact, I think even the National Security Advisor has condemned these things as, hate attacks, but arrests thereafter, nothing. So that's why I'm saying there is a problem in how they get this law and order system going. They have to identify clearly, if this is a hate speech, what is the action that they're going to take thereof. And here, one good thing, however, which has come out, and this I think is where the Canadian Hindus need to go forward, is that both sides have come together to have a resolution. They've signed a resolution where they've said, we're not going to let this happen anymore. And they've condemned Trudeau as well. Yeah. This is the way forward, where the communities have come together.
Brahma Chilani, what can India do from here on? Because there's not very much left in terms of diplomatic relations. There is an important role these consular officials have. I mean, you have to process visas. The number of Indo-Canadians is huge. There are important airline links which exist between the two countries. Do you believe that the relationship between India and Canada has to be kept at this level?
The problem is this, that the relationship has been derailed but not ruptured. Neither side wants a rupturing of this relationship. But the downward spiral in relations continues, apparent from today's tweet by Modi. In contrast to Trudeau, who has been personally leading the charge against India since September last year, Modi has kept quiet. He has been discreet. He has avoided speaking publicly about the row with Canada. And today he finally spoke up. It really shows that things now have that push has come to shove, and India is being forced to respond. But there are two issues here, as you know, Vishnu, and in fact, your excellent interview with Mr. Dosang, who's one of the most successful Sikh politicians in Canada. He's been the Premier of British Columbia. He's been a federal minister, and I think he very well laid out the issues in Canada as to how this Khalistan militancy has gained momentum. This is an old scourge which has resurfaced with a vengeance for two reasons. One, Canada has refused to clean up its act, and two, India has failed to exert sustained pressure on Canada. Even after Air India Flight 182 bombing, successive governments in India did not exert pressure on Canada to clean up its act. So today, India is facing a reality which partly is of its own making. Imagine if any other country's airliner had been bombed and so many passengers had been killed. These were passengers mostly of Indian origin, even though many of them or majority of them were Canadian citizens. Yet, successive governments in India did not exert pressure on Canada to clean up its act, to bring the culprits, the perpetrators of Air India bombing to justice. Even the mastermind of that bombing, as identified by Canadian investigators, Talvinder Parmar, he was not brought to justice by Canada. He was killed by Indian police when he sneaked into India from Pakistan. So, to some respect, to some extent, I think India should also accept blame for not putting Canada on notice, for not exerting sufficient pressure on Canada. We tend to react, whenever there's some new episode, some new incident, and then we go back to normal pattern. But now the relationship has been so damaged.
I take your point, Brahmachalani, that it can't be back to normal. But the situation is dire in terms of the relationship, and I think the threat of violence against Indian nationals, because I believe there were many Indian nationals over there, it's on Canadian soil. That's a matter of huge concern. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us. I've run out of time on this discussion.